Today, we uncover one of the most harrowing and unjust stories in American history. The tragic tale of George Stinney Jr., a 14-year-old black boy from South Carolina in 1944. George, holding his Bible tightly, was escorted by white officers to a chamber where he would meet his fate. But what led to this horrifying moment? How did a young boy find himself accused of a crime he did not commit? This is the story of George Stinney Jr. Let me lay a picture for you clearly. Let's go back to 1944, South Carolina. A railway line ran through the middle of town, dividing it into two distinct neighborhoods. On one side lived white people only, on the other side, black communities. These two communities had no interaction. The color of your skin determined your rights, your opportunities, and in many cases, your fate. George Stinney Jr. lived with his family on the black side of town. His father worked hard every day to support George, his mother, and his siblings. Life was simple, but the racial divide loomed over their heads like a shadow. One evening, a knock at the door shattered their quiet life. It was unusual rare even for a white person to come into their neighborhood. Standing at the door was a white man who explained that two young white girls, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, had gone missing. A search party was being organized to find them. Hearing this, George remembered something. Earlier that day, while walking home with one of his siblings, he had met the two girls riding their bicycles. They were small, just kids, and had stopped to ask for directions. They were looking for a certain flower or fruit. George had kindly pointed them in the right direction, and the girls went on their way. That was the last time anyone from George's neighborhood saw them. The search party scoured the area, and by the next day, the two girls were tragically found in a ditch. Their bodies bore the horrifying marks of blunt force trauma. The autopsy revealed they had been brutally beaten in the head, leading to their deaths. It was a heartbreaking discovery, two innocent young lives, stolen in such a violent way. The community was in shock. Investigations began, but they were far from fair. Two theories emerged. One was quickly dismissed, though it would later prove to be the truth. The other pointed the finger squarely at George Stinney Jr. The accusation was that George, a 14-year-old boy, had directed the girls to their deaths, followed them, and murdered them. It was a baseless claim, but in the eyes of a society steeped in racial prejudice, George was an easy target. The police came for him. They took him from his home, away from his family, and subjected him to an interrogation. This so-called interrogation lasted just a few minutes. By the time George came out, he was already traumatized, and the police claimed he had confessed to the crime. But there was no written or signed confession. It was all verbal, and it was all fabricated. What followed was a sham of a trial. George's parents were not allowed to be present in the courtroom. He was appointed a white attorney who showed no interest in defending him. The trial lasted just over 2 hours, and the jury, a group of all white men, took only 10 minutes to reach their verdict: guilty. George Stinney Jr. was sentenced to death by electrocution. In 1944, black people were not allowed to vote, which meant no black individuals could serve on the jury. The system was stacked against George from the start. He was just a boy, yet the justice system treated him as though he were a hardened criminal. George's execution was scheduled just 81 days after his arrest. On that fateful day, he was led into the death chamber, carrying his Bible, the same Bible they would use as a booster seat because George was so small. At only 14 years old and weighing just 40 kilograms, the electric chair, designed for adults, was too big for him. They strapped him in as best they could, but the headpiece didn't fit properly. During the electrocution, the headpiece slipped off, exposing his face as he cried in pain. White foam came from his mouth as the electricity coursed through his body. George died in agony, a child executed by a system that had already failed him. The aftermath of George's execution was equally devastating for his family. They were targeted and ostracized. His father lost his job, and the family had to flee their home to escape the wrath of the white community. The injustice didn't end with George's death. But the story doesn't end there. 70 years later, in 2014, George's case was reopened. New evidence came to light, including the fact that he had not been given a fair trial. The first theory, the one that had been ignored in 1944, was revisited. This theory suggested that the two girls had wandered onto the property of a wealthy white family, asking for directions. Someone from that household had offered to help them, but it was the last time the girls were seen alive. As part of the re-examination of the case, a confession surfaced. A man from the family which was suspected, on his deathbed, admitted to killing the two girls. After that, he passed on. George Stinney Jr. had been innocent all along. His name was finally cleared, but the pain and injustice of his execution remain a stain on history. This story is heartbreaking. It is a reminder of the deep injustices that existed, and still exist, in our world. George Stinney Jr. was a 14-year-old boy, robbed of his life and his future. His story demands to be remembered, not just as a tragedy, but as a call for justice and change. If you found this story moving, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more real-life stories that need to be told. Together, we can keep the memory of George Stinney Jr. alive and continue to learn from history.